On the shores of Lake St. Clair, along the gilded coast of Grosse Pointe, Michigan, there is an empty space, a silent wound in the landscape where the manicured lawns of industrial royalty meet the cold, grey water. Cars whisper past on the lakeshore road, their occupants oblivious. They see only grass and trees, another plot of priceless real estate. But they are looking at a crime scene, a place where a titan of American industry and his entire legacy were deliberately and methodically erased from history. This was the site of a fortress, a sprawling English Renaissance manor that once stood as a monument not to the automobile itself, but to the very thing that gave it a window to the world. It was built with a fortune forged in silica and fire, in the deafening roar of the glass furnace. A fortune that was, for a time, as vast and influential as that of Henry Ford himself. Yet you will not find this man's statue in the city square. His name is a footnote, a ghost in the archives. His home, unlike the nearby Ford and Dodge estates, was not preserved as a museum. It was annihilated, pulverized into dust and carted away in the dead of night. Why? Why does a dynasty that provided the literal vision for the automotive age, the windshields, the windows, the very lens through which America saw its future, vanish from the national consciousness? Why, when you dig into the municipal archives, do the architectural plans for this specific property appear misfiled, damaged, or simply missing? Why do newspaper accounts from the era of its demolition speak of the event with a strange, almost fearful brevity, as if reporting on the quiet funeral of a dangerous secret rather than the loss of an architectural landmark? The official story is a bland and convenient fiction: rising taxes, the prohibitive cost of maintenance, a family that simply moved on. But this explanation is an insult to the scale of the mystery. It doesn't explain the haste. It doesn't explain the thoroughness of the erasure. It doesn't explain the silence that followed. This was not a simple demolition. It was an execution, a calculated campaign to wipe a story off the map. We are left with one terrifying central question. What was built into the stone and mortar of that house? What dark truth about the raw, brutal foundations of American industry, a truth about the human cost of progress, was so dangerous that the entire physical and historical record of its existence had to be systematically shattered, buried, and forgotten? We have all seen the headlines, the drone footage, the breathless television specials. The One, a name delivered with the finality of a king's decree. Poised on a Bel-Air summit like a stark white spaceship, it was presented to the world not as a house, but as the final word in residential architecture. The undisputed heavyweight champion of luxury, with a price tag that felt less like a valuation and more like a challenge to civilization itself, $500 million. This was the official narrative, a masterpiece of public relations. The story was simple, seductive, and tailored for an age of obscene wealth. An anonymous, world-conquering billionaire would ascend the hill, write a check that would rival the GDP of a small nation, and acquire the ultimate trophy. It was meant to be a monument to the peak of capitalism, a marble and glass testament to a new gilded age. But that narrative is a fiction. It is the most beautiful, most expensive lie ever told in the history of real estate. And our investigation begins not by looking at the house, but by dismantling the story itself. Because this was never a tale about ultimate luxury. It was a desperate, high-wire act of financial survival, a story about debt, delusion, and the corrosive nature of an ambition that had slipped its leash. The first clue is the most obvious one. There was no billionaire. The One was not a commissioned project. It was a speculative build of unimaginable scale. It was a ghost ship built and launched onto the market with no captain and no destination, only the frantic hope that someone, somewhere, would be rich enough and foolish enough to claim it, before the entire enterprise sank under the weight of its own costs. And at the center of it all was its creator, Nile Niami. He was not a reserved artisan or a legacy developer from a dynasty of builders. He was a former producer of low-budget, direct-to-video action films. He understood spectacle, he understood illusion, and he approached the construction of the One not as an architect, but as a Hollywood producer, financing his one last epic blockbuster. He was selling a fantasy, both to the public and to himself. This is the hidden truth of the One. The foundation of this 105,000 square foot behemoth was not poured with concrete and steel. It was built upon a mountain of high-interest, short-term loans from lenders who specialize in high-risk ventures. This was not the patient capital of old money. This was fast, brutal, and unforgiving financing. Every pane of glass, every slab of marble, every infinity pool was paid for with borrowed time. The project wasn't a monument to wealth. It was a machine designed to generate it for one man. Unlike the great mansions of the past, built to house dynasties for generations, the One was constructed with a single purpose: to be sold. It was an exit strategy rendered in stone. It was a house of cards, built with other people's money, teetering on the precipice of a market that had to be perfect and a buyer that might not even exist. So we must discard the story of the trophy home. That is the surface, the gleaming white facade designed to distract. The real story, the one buried in court filings and default notices, is a far more important lesson for our time. It is a cautionary tale about how the language of visionary ambition can be used to disguise a reckless gamble. This was not the pinnacle of American luxury. It was the genesis of the most spectacular, most beautiful, and most public bankruptcy in modern real estate history. Every spectacular bankruptcy has a ground zero, a physical point on the map where the fantasy was born and where the debt was first incurred. And the genesis of the One's collapse was not a flawed business plan or a bad loan. It was a patch of dirt, a 3.8-acre promontory perched at the apex of Bel-Air, the most exclusive enclave in Los Angeles. This was not just a location, it was the entire premise of the gamble. To understand the strategy, you must first understand the geography of power in Los Angeles. Bel-Air is a kingdom of gates and guards, a labyrinth of winding roads designed to confuse and repel outsiders. It is old money, new tech, and Hollywood royalty, all living in a state of self-imposed, heavily secured exile. But even within this rarefied air, there are hierarchies. And the plot Niami acquired was the pinnacle. It wasn't just on a hill, it was the hill. The motive was not residential, it was imperial. The land offered something no other property could, an uninterrupted 360-degree view of the entire Los Angeles basin. This was the weaponized feature, the single asset that was meant to justify an impossible price. From this vantage point, the owner would not simply live in the city, they would command it. It was a position of supreme visual dominance, a real-life throne from which to survey one's kingdom. Look west, and you see the coastline curving toward Malibu, the Pacific Ocean stretching into an infinite horizon. Look east, and the steel and glass spires of downtown LA rise from the haze, the heart of the city's commerce beating at your feet. To the south, the endless grid of the city sprawls out, a glittering carpet of lights at night. To the north, the Santa Monica Mountains form a rugged, impassable barrier. This was not a view. It was a map of your domain. This panoramic ownership was the sole justification for the $500 million figure. Without it, the One is just a very large, very sterile building. But with it, the argument could be made that you were buying something that could never be replicated. You were purchasing the ultimate perspective. This location was the collateral for the fantasy, the linchpin of the entire sales pitch to both investors and a hypothetical buyer. It was an argument against gravity, against reason, against all market precedent. Furthermore, the location provided absolute isolation. Perched at the end of a cul-de-sac, accessible only by a single private road, the property was a natural fortress. It offered total privacy from the world below while keeping that world in constant view. It was a one-way mirror on a continental scale. This strategic choice was not about finding a beautiful place to live. It was about securing a platform, a stage upon which the world's greatest performance of wealth could be enacted, a performance that required the perfect, unassailable setting. A perfect setting is merely a stage. It is nothing without a motive, a driving force for the drama that is to unfold. To understand the one, we must look past the balance sheets and the loan documents and into the mind of its creator. We must ask the most fundamental question: why build a house so large, so expensive, that no rational human being could ever justify its purchase? The answer is not found in the logic of the market. It is found in the psychology of the monument. The driving motivation behind the one was never merely to build a house. It was to forge a legacy in glass and steel. Niall Niami was not constructing a home. He was authoring his own mythology. This was a project driven by a single, all-consuming desire to create the absolute trophy, an object so unique, so singular, that its possession would confer a status beyond that of a mere billionaire. It would elevate its owner, and by extension its creator, into the realm of legend. This explains the most puzzling aspect of the project. It was built without a buyer. A traditional developer identifies a customer and meets their needs. Niami did the opposite. He was building a monument to his own vision, supremely confident that the vision itself was so powerful it would create the customer. He was not serving a market. He was creating an icon and waiting for a worshipper to arrive with an offering. Niami himself provided the key to this mystery in his public statements. He did not speak the language of a developer, but of a visionary artist. "This is the Mona Lisa of the residential world," he famously declared. This was not a sales pitch. It was a statement of belief. By framing the house as a priceless work of art, he attempted to lift it out of the grubby world of appraisals and comparable sales. A Da Vinci is not valued by the square inch of canvas. And the one, in his mind, was not to be valued by the square foot. It was to be valued for its singularity. He even coined a new term for his creation, the giga-mansion. This was not just about size. It was an attempt to create an entirely new asset class, a category of one. It was a move to shatter the ceiling of the luxury market and establish a new benchmark that he alone had set. The ambition was not to win the existing game, but to invent a new one that only he could play. And it is here, in this grand delusion, that we find the roots of the financial catastrophe. When you genuinely believe you are building a modern-day pyramid, the normal rules of finance cease to apply. The immense, crushing weight of the debt, over $190 million, was not seen as a liability. It was simply the necessary cost of creating a masterpiece. The motivation was not profit, it was permanence. He was building for history, not for a client. The great secret of the one is that it was never a house. It was a monument to a single, titanic ego, a physical manifestation of one man's desperate need to be remembered. And the price of that kind of immortality is always, inevitably, bankruptcy. Before the bankruptcy, before the final, ruinous price was paid for that immortality, the monument had to be given a form. And the message of that form, the public face of this grand ambition, was designed to be one thing above all else: unapproachable. The exterior of the one, designed by the architect Paul MacLean, is not an invitation. It is a declaration of separation. This is not the architecture of home. It is a geometry of stark, uncompromising lines, a composition of immense white plains and vast, empty walls of glass. It lacks any of the signifiers of traditional wealth. No charming courtyards, no romantic columns recalling a Tuscan villa, no warm stone suggesting a French chateau. It rejects history. Its style is a cold, corporate futurism, so minimalist and severe that it feels less like a residence and more like the global headquarters of an omnipotent and slightly sinister tech corporation. The materials themselves tell the story. The endless glass is not there to connect the interior to the landscape in a dialogue with nature. It is there to transform the panoramic view into a commodity, a live-streamed image to be consumed from within a climate-controlled vitrine. The white marble that clads its surfaces is not warm and veined, but a sterile, almost clinical white, reinforcing the feeling of a private museum or a high-security laboratory. This is a structure that does not embrace its environment. It holds it at a distance, observing it from behind a sterile barrier. The most telling feature, however, is the water. The house is surrounded on three sides by a moat of infinity pools and water features. This is not a playful residential pool, it is a defensive boundary, a liquid wall. In medieval times, a moat was designed to repel invaders and project the power of the Lord within the castle. The function here is identical. It is an act of architectural intimidation, a final, emphatic line drawn between the owner and the rest of the human race. The message, broadcast to the entire city below, is clear. I am above you. I am separate from you, and you will never, ever get in. That architectural message of separation, the cold and intimidating exterior, was not a bluff. It was a promise that if you were one of the chosen few granted entry, you would not be stepping into a home. You would be entering an engine, an immense and intricate social machine engineered for one specific purpose, the performance of power on a global scale. To understand its function, you must first look at the raw specifications, the blueprint of the ambition. 105,000 square feet. This is not a number that can be understood in residential terms. It is the square footage of a luxury hotel or a corporate campus. The 21 bedrooms are not for a family. They are for a visiting delegation, for a corporate entourage, for the key players in a global summit hosted by a private individual. The 42 bathrooms are not for convenience. They are an exercise in crowd control, a necessary piece of infrastructure for managing events with hundreds of guests. The list of amenities is not a list of comforts. It is a list of venues. The 50-seat cinema is not a media room. It is a private screening theater designed to host premieres and exert influence over the entertainment industry. The 4-lane bowling alley is not for family fun. It is a branded experience, a novelty distraction for guests at a product launch or a political fundraiser. The 10,000-bottle wine cellar is not a personal collection. It is the inventory for a commercial enterprise capable of servicing multiple bars and hundreds of patrons a night. The full-service salon and spa is the on-site green room, a facility to prepare the hosts and their most valued guests for the main event. And here we find the smoking gun, the single feature that exposes the building's true soul, its massive, fully equipped nightclub. A home does not have a nightclub. An event space does. This was the heart of the machine, the central chamber designed for the projection of status. With its own bar, DJ booth, and a designated VIP section, it is a perfect microcosm of the building's ethos. Even within this fortress of exclusivity, there is another, more exclusive inner sanctum. It is a blueprint for social warfare. The very layout of the house was a mechanism for segregation. The design is a masterclass in separating the public performance spaces, the grand halls, the galleries, the nightclub, from the unseen logistical corridors required to service them. And somewhere, almost as an afterthought in this vast complex, were the hypothetical private quarters of the owner. This was not a home with a party wing. This was a commercial venue with a small penthouse apartment attached. The interior is the hollow core of the promise made by the exterior. It is a space meticulously designed to host a life that was never lived, a social calendar that was never filled. It is a silent theater, stripped of intimacy and warmth, a perfect, sterile machine waiting for an operator who never showed up. The price was not just the millions in debt, it was the complete and total annihilation of the very concept of home. But a machine of this scale cannot simply be placed upon the land. The land itself must be broken, subjugated, and entirely remade in the machine's image. Before the first sterile white wall could be erected, a war had to be waged not against wild nature, but against the fundamental reality of the planet itself, its geology. The story of the one's control over its environment is not one of landscaping. It is a story of geological engineering on a scale bordering on mania. To create the perfect level platform required for this architectural statement, the summit of the hill had to be obliterated. This was not a gentle grading of the soil. This was an act of industrial violence. The official records, buried in planning permits, reveal the staggering scale of the operation. More than 49,000 cubic yards of earth and rock were excavated and hauled away. 49,000. That is the equivalent of a convoy of dump trucks stretching for miles, each one carrying a piece of a mountain that was deemed an inconvenience to the grand vision. It was geological surgery without anesthetic, scooping the heart out of the landscape to create a perfectly flat, perfectly artificial stage. The result of this terraforming is not a house that sits in its environment. It is a house that has replaced it entirely. It is a self-contained biosphere, a hermetically sealed world that manufactures its own perfection. The manicured turf and sparse, strategically placed trees are not a garden. They are an outdoor carpet, a thin green veneer stretched over a complex latticework of drainage systems, irrigation lines, and massive concrete retaining walls. The air on its terraces feels different, the silence is deeper. It is an embassy of the artificial planted on conquered territory. This absolute control is what enables the house's greatest illusion. The massive terraces and the signature infinity pools are meticulously engineered to erase the horizon line. They create the seamless, breathtaking sensation that the house is not anchored to the earth at all, but is floating in the sky above Los Angeles. This is the ultimate expression of power, to defy gravity itself, to provide its owner with the perspective of a deity looking down from a cloud, untethered from the messy, unpredictable world below. But this illusion of effortless levitation comes at a colossal, hidden price. The real battle here is a constant, silent war against gravity. The true foundation of the one is not the house itself, but the colossal, unseen retaining walls, fortifications of steel and concrete plunged deep into the bedrock. These are the ramparts holding back the immense pressure of a California hillside that is, by its very nature, unstable and alive. The true cost was not in the marble or the glass, but in the brute force required to tame a mountain and to hold it at bay day after day, year after year. The perfect, serene environment is a facade, masking a constant, high-stakes struggle against the slow, inexorable power of the earth. Every great house, every palace and monument has its zenith, a golden age, however brief, when its halls were filled with music and laughter, when its social calendar dictated the movements of the elite. There was a moment when it was alive, when it fulfilled the purpose for which it was built. But when we search for the peak of the one, we find a void, a historical black hole. Because its zenith was a phantom, Its golden age was a meticulously crafted, expertly marketed mirage. The house was never finished. It was never granted a certificate of occupancy. It never felt the warmth of a single resident. And so, its life was a performance, a simulation of habitation staged for an audience of potential buyers and the global media. The social rituals of the one were not parties, galas, or intimate dinners. They were marketing events, each one a calculated move in a desperate, high-stakes game to find a savior before the creditors circling the property finally moved in for the kill. Let us analyze these rituals. The first were the media tours. Teams from CNBC, Architectural Digest, and a parade of online influencers were guided through the silent, cavernous spaces. This was not journalism, it was choreography. Niall Niami was the master of ceremonies, presenting each feature not as a component of a home, but as a talking point in a sales pitch broadcast to the world's 1%. The cameras glided through empty rooms, capturing a fantasy, not a reality. The house was the star of its own reality show, a show in which no one actually lived. Then came the promotional videos. These were the house's true biographies, short films of pure fiction. Sleek, impossibly beautiful models, actors hired for the day, would lounge by the infinity pools, clink champagne glasses on the terraces, and descend the grand staircases in couture gowns. They were props, human set dressing designed to project an aspirational narrative onto the sterile white walls. They were ghosts of a life that never was, their laughter unheard because it was never real. Their purpose was to make the void look like a paradise. Finally, there were the broker events. These were the most crucial rituals of all. Hundreds of luxury real estate agents were invited to tour the property, treated to champagne and catered hors d'oeuvres. But this was not a social gathering. It was a sales briefing. It was the mobilization of a mercenary army. The goal was to dazzle them, to overwhelm their senses, so they would carry the legend of the one back to their wealthy clients. This was the social calendar of the one, a schedule of photo shoots, video productions, and sales meetings. It was not a life, it was a marketing campaign. Every event was a frantic effort to create enough hype, enough buzz, to levitate the impossible $500 million price tag just long enough to land a buyer. The house never lived. It was merely a soundstage, the most expensive and elaborate film set in history, built for a movie whose final, glorious scene, the sale, was never shot. Every great fortune has a source, a dirty engine hidden from public view that generates the power to build empires and monuments. For the industrial barons of the Gilded Age, it was the coal mine, the steel furnace, the oil derrick. But what was the engine that powered the construction of the one? What furnace forged the capital for this $500 million dream? The answer is the most terrifying part of this investigation. There was no engine. The house was the engine, and it was designed to run on a fuel more volatile and dangerous than any other, pure debt. This was not a monument built from a position of existing wealth. It was a speculative build on a scale that defies comprehension. A gamble taken not with house money, but with borrowed capital of the most unforgiving kind. Niall Niami was not spending his fortune. He was betting the bank, and the bank wasn't even his. He was engaged in the ultimate act of financial leveraging, using other people's money to construct a fantasy that, if sold, would make him a king. If it failed, it would create a crater of debt so deep it would swallow him whole. The paper trail leads us directly to the source of this power. The primary creditor was a firm named Hankey Capital, a Los Angeles-based lender known for providing high-interest, short-term, hard money loans for projects deemed too risky by traditional banks. Hankey provided an initial loan of $82.5 million, which eventually swelled to over $106 million. But that was just the beginning. The total secured debt on the project, owed to a syndicate of lenders, climbed to a staggering figure, over $190 million. This is the dirty secret of the One. The engine was not a business. It was a series of high-risk loans, each with its own ticking clock of accumulating interest. Every day that the house sat unfinished, every month that a buyer failed to materialize, the debt grew, compounding relentlessly. Imagine the psychological pressure of that reality, waking up every single morning knowing you are nearly $200 million in the red, with the interest payments alone amounting to a fortune. This was not the confident building of a legacy. It was a frantic race against a financial doomsday clock. The human cost of this engine was the complete and total financial annihilation of its architect. The immense pressure to maintain the illusion of success, to keep borrowing, to keep building, while the mountain of debt grew ever larger, was unsustainable. This was not a home built on a foundation of stone, but on a foundation of promissory notes. It was the ultimate monument to the 21st century illusion of wealth, a house built with credit cards, destined to be repossessed the moment the bill came due. When a financial engine built on debt finally seizes, the story that follows is usually a predictable one. A quiet, clinical process unfolds in courtrooms and boardrooms. Lawyers exchange motions, receivers are appointed, and the asset is disposed of in an orderly, almost boring fashion. This is the story that should have been written about the One. It should have been a tale of foreclosure, a dry case study in speculative failure. But that is not what happened, because just as the financial reality was about to deliver its final, fatal blow, the story was suddenly and violently eclipsed. The object doing the eclipsing was not a market crash or a legal maneuver. It was the creator himself, Niall Niami. As the specter of foreclosure loomed, he did not retreat into the shadows. He stepped directly into the spotlight, transforming the narrative from a business failure into a deeply personal, increasingly erratic public drama. He refused to let his monument die a quiet death, and in his fight to save it, he became a story far more compelling and far more bizarre than the house itself. The first sign of this shift came in his promotional videos. They morphed from slick, aspirational marketing into something else entirely: personal pleas, defiant manifestos. Niami himself became the central character, speaking directly to the camera, no longer just selling a property, but defending his very soul, his legacy. The polished illusion of the untouchable visionary began to crack, revealing the raw desperation of a man on the brink. The story was no longer about luxury. It was about one man's crusade against the forces of finance that were about to consume him. Then, the conflict became a public war. Niami began giving interviews and posting on social media, openly attacking his primary lender, Don Hankey. He framed the narrative as a battle between a creative genius and a predatory financier. This was no longer a business dispute. It was a public feud, a soap opera played out in the headlines. The intricate details of the loans and the construction flaws were forgotten, replaced by a much simpler, more primal story. A creator fighting to stop the vultures from stealing his masterpiece. The final, definitive act of this eclipse was the most desperate and delusional of all. In a last-ditch effort to raise capital, Niami announced a plan to launch a cryptocurrency, the One Coin. He proposed to tokenize the house, allowing the public to buy a piece of the monument and, in doing so, save it from the auction block. It was a bizarre, tragicomic Hail Mary, a fusion of real estate speculation and cryptomania that demonstrated a complete detachment from reality. And in that moment, the house vanished. The story of the One, the architectural marvel, the financial gamble, was completely and irrevocably overshadowed by the public unraveling of Nile Niami. The world was no longer watching a foreclosure. It was watching the climax of a Greek tragedy, the drama of one man's hubris, his epic struggle, and his inevitable spectacular fall was infinitely more fascinating than the fate of an empty building. The house had become a silent backdrop to the far more interesting story of its creator's demise. But while the world watched the melodrama of one man's demise, a colder, more brutal story was being written in the ledgers of his creditors and the inspection reports of the city. A story that had no protagonist and no emotion. It was the simple, unforgiving arithmetic of failure. The collapse of the one was not a single, dramatic event. It was a methodical process, a cascade of failures, each one compounding the last, until the entire structure became unsustainable. Our investigation reveals 4 distinct pillars of this collapse. The first and most powerful was the debt. This was the original sin of the project, over $190 million. It is a number so large it becomes abstract, but its reality was a daily, visceral assault. This was not a gentle 30-year mortgage from a community bank. It was a series of high-interest, hard money loans, a form of financing that is less a partnership and more a countdown timer to financial execution. The interest on this debt did not simply accumulate, it attacked. Every single day, tens of thousands of dollars were added to the deficit. It was a hemorrhage of capital that could only be stopped by one thing: a sale. When Nile Niami finally defaulted on these loans, it was not a strategic choice. It was the inevitable moment when a body can no longer sustain itself against a fatal infection. The default triggered a chain reaction of legal actions, placing the property on an irreversible path to receivership and the auction block. The second pillar of failure was the house itself. The monument was flawed. While the public saw a gleaming white palace in drone shots, the court-appointed receiver and potential buyers found a far messier reality. The house was a sprawling, unfinished construction site plagued by a litany of defects. There were reports of cracked marble, improperly installed drainage, and leaking seals around the many pools and water features, a death sentence in a house made of glass and stone. Most damning of all, the one had never been issued a certificate of occupancy. Legally, it was not a house. It was a hazard. A buyer would not be acquiring a finished masterpiece, but a multi-million-dollar construction problem, a Pandora's box of potential liens from unpaid contractors, and years of remedial work just to make it habitable. The Mona Lisa of the residential world was, in fact, a damaged canvas that had been left out in the rain. The third pillar was the world outside the fortress walls. The one was conceived in a different epoch, a pre-pandemic era of frictionless global travel and ostentatious, globe-trotting wealth. Its entire sales strategy depended on attracting a very specific, very small pool of international billionaires from Russia, the Middle East, and China. Then, in 2020, the world shut down. The COVID-19 pandemic slammed the door on international travel, making it physically impossible for the target demographic to even tour the property. The house, designed as a global icon, suddenly found itself stranded on a hill in Los Angeles with no one to sell to. Compounding this was a subtle but decisive shift in the ultra-luxury market itself. The era of the giga-mansion was already beginning to feel dated, a gaudy remnant of a less self-conscious time. The one was a monument to a party that was already over. Finally, there was the number itself, $500 million. This was the fourth and perhaps most fatal pillar of the collapse. The price was not a valuation, it was a publicity stunt. It was a fantasy figure, untethered to any market reality, with no comparable sales to support it. In the world of billionaires, where value is still a consideration, this price was not an attraction. It was a warning sign. It signaled not exclusivity, but absurdity. No one wanted to be the greater fool who paid a fictional price for an unfinished, flawed asset. The number, intended to create a myth, instead created a vacuum. It was so high, it repelled the very buyers it was meant to attract. These four pillars, the crushing debt, the physical flaws, the changed world, and the impossible price, formed a perfect cage of failure. It was no longer a question of if the project would collapse, but when. The final auction would not be the sale of a dream. It would be the liquidation of a ruin. The liquidation of the ruin began not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical turning of pages in a courtroom. In 2021, the story of The One officially ended and its autopsy began. The monument was stripped of its name and its creator, becoming a case file. In Re Cresceloid LLC, the king was dethroned. Niall Niami, the visionary, the showman, was now just a debtor, a ghost in his own machine. Control of the property was handed over to a court-appointed receiver, a legal undertaker whose sole job was to prepare the corpse of the dream for its final disposition. This was the period of disenchantment. The mythology was stripped away, layer by layer, by the cold, impartial language of legal filings and structural engineers' reports. The house was no longer a palace, it was an asset. Its value was no longer a grand vision. It was a number to be argued over by creditors. The magic, if it had ever existed, had evaporated, leaving behind the stark, unglamorous reality of a deeply troubled and massively over-leveraged piece of real estate. The life of the One was over. All that remained was to sell the remains. The final act took place in March of 2022. There was no glamorous gathering of billionaires in a wood-paneled auction house. The grandest home in America was sold in the most mundane way imaginable, a no-reserve online auction. It was the ultimate indignity. A monument designed to be a singular, priceless trophy was reduced to a listing on a website, sold sight unseen to the highest bidder in a digital fire sale. The bidding was not the flurry of a king's ransom being offered. It was a slow, anemic trickle, a far cry from the $500 million fantasy. When the digital gavel finally fell, the winning bid was a number that represented a catastrophic failure, $126 million. With the auction house commission, the final sale price came to $141 million. This number was not a rescue. It was a final, brutal confirmation of the loss. It was not nearly enough to cover the more than $190 million in secured debt. The primary lenders took a massive loss. The dozens of unsecured creditors, the contractors, the suppliers, the artisans who had poured their labor into the monument, were completely wiped out. The dream had not just died, it had taken everyone it owed money to down with it. And who was the buyer? Not a Russian oligarch, not a Middle Eastern royal, not a tech titan seeking the ultimate statement. The buyer was Richard Sagian, the CEO of Fashion Nova, the king of fast fashion. This was the final, perfect insult to the entire project. A house built to be a timeless, singular monument, a Mona Lisa for the ages, was purchased by a man whose empire was built on the exact opposite principle: mass-produced, trendy, and ultimately disposable clothing. The One was not acquired as a legacy, it was acquired as a bargain. So what remains of the dream? What is the archive left behind for future historians? It is not an archive of stone and marble, but of digital ether and legal paper. The primary sources are the trove of sensational media articles, a vast ocean of digital ink that chronicles the myth. Then there are the bankruptcy court filings, the true Rosetta Stone of the project, which detail the unvarnished financial pathology. And finally, There are the promotional videos, the personal testaments of Niall Niami himself. These are the most important artifacts of all, a digital record of the hubris, the ambition, and the delusion, a ghost story told by the ghost himself, preserved forever on a server. When we sift through that digital archive, the court filings, the desperate promotional videos, the mountain of breathless press clippings, we are not just looking at the history of a failed real estate project, we are looking at the wreckage of a very modern and very dangerous idea. The story of the one is a landmark, not for its architecture, but for the clarity of its lesson. It is the definitive case study in the oldest story of them all, the story of hubris. And what it teaches us is that hubris is the biggest bubble of all. The $500 million price tag was not an asset valuation. It was a measure of ego. The project was a grand experiment designed to test a single fatal hypothesis. That vision, if projected with enough confidence and audacity, could triumph over the fundamental laws of finance. That a myth, if told loudly enough, could conjure a market into existence. That one man could, through sheer force of will, bend the entire economic reality of Los Angeles to his personal fantasy. It was a spectacular failure. This investigation has always been about the razor-thin line between vision and delusion. A true visionary sees a future that is possible and builds a bridge to it. A delusionist sees a future they desire and simply pretends the bridge already exists. The one was an act of delusion. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that no matter how high you build, you can never escape the gravity of the market. The cold, immutable law that a thing is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it is not a suggestion. It is a physical constant. The house was not an asset. It was a liability of historic proportions, an anchor of debt that inevitably dragged its creator down to the bottom. And this is why this story is so critical right now. We live in an age of manufactured realities, of speculative bubbles in everything from cryptocurrencies to digital art. We are relentlessly sold the idea that value is a story, a narrative that can be willed into existence. The one stands on its hill as a silent, terrifying rebuttal to that entire philosophy. It is a 100,000 square foot monument to the fact that reality always, eventually, sends a bill. The market is the final arbiter, and it has no interest in your story, your vision, or your ego. For any future historian, any investigator seeking the unvarnished truth of this financial cataclysm, the path does not lead to the glossy pages of Architectural Digest or the curated clips on YouTube. It leads to the drab, beige filing cabinets of the Los Angeles County Bankruptcy Court. The key to this entire mystery is a public document, the case file of NRE, Cresceloid LLC. This is the black box recorder of the crash. Inside, you will not find glamour. You will find the cold, hard data of the disaster. You will find the exhaustive list of creditors, not just the big-time lenders, but the small-scale electricians, plumbers, and artisans who were never paid. This is the human cost, rendered in spreadsheets. You will find the receiver's reports, which meticulously detail every construction flaw, every missing permit, every leaking seal. And you will find the final accounting, the brutal arithmetic that shows exactly how a $500 million dream produced a $100 million loss. This is not a story. It is the evidence. It is a roadmap drawn in red ink, showing the precise route from speculative fantasy to financial ruin. If you appreciate deep investigations that peel back the layers of myth to reveal the truth, then your support is what makes this work possible. These stories take time, research, and a commitment to digging past the easy headlines. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new investigation. But most importantly, I want to hear from you. The greatest stories are often the ones hiding in plain sight. in the comments below. Tell me what forgotten building, what fallen dynasty, or what historical mystery you want me to investigate next. Because history only survives when we refuse to let it be forgotten.